So my PhD is around perfecting the pacing strategies of Australian swimmers. I must admit it's been a while since I've looked at this. This is my pre-submission presentation I had to give at Canberra back in December now, so it's been a while. So yeah, like Jess said, I submitted the 28th of February, so a few months ago now. So hopefully, yeah, I'll hear back soon. But I'll just run through, I guess, a bit about each of my studies without going into too much detail, so I don't bore you all on swimming. Okay, so when we talk about pacing, we're talking about the distribution of energy expenditure. And there's a few reasons why it's more important in swimming compared to some land-based sports. And one reason is swimming has a really low mechanical efficiency. So that's the amount of mechanical work that's actually converted into energy. So compared to, say, land-based sports like cycling, which is above 18%, swimming can be less than 18%, and that depends on the stroke. And the other thing is the resistive properties of water. So there's a cubic relationship between force and velocity, whereas on land that's linear. So that means just small changes in swimming speed can lead to disproportionate increases in energy expenditure and drag. So that has a big impact. So pacing is really important in swimming. I won't go into too much detail on that. So basically, I guess the overall aim of my PhD was to provide coaches and sports scientists with practical tools and guidelines that they can actually use day to day in the training and competition environment to help improve and develop pacing skills in their swimmers and hopefully improve overall swimming performance. So it's very much, I guess, an applied type PhD where the outcomes were very coach orientated rather than, I guess, a typical what I'd call sciencey PhD. So it's very coach focused. So the first study, I just did a systematic review of the literature. I was quite lucky, there's not a lot of literature out there, so that didn't take too long. So I got that published in Sports Med back in 2018 now. And basically what we found was there was quite a lot of research on characterization of pacing profiles in competition, how reproducible they are, but there wasn't a lot on how we actually train pacing, what different pacing strategies might be better than others. The use of pacing aids in training and also pacing a relay. So the focus was really on individual events. So that kind of led us to, I guess, where we'd take the following studies of my PhD. So I guess we called it study 2, but I guess the first real study of the PhD was looking at pacing in relay events. And this is actually published in IJSPP, finally got printed last month, got accepted last year, took a while to turn around. But that one's out there, which is good. So the data, this was just getting data from online results websites. So it didn't actually involve me going out to the field and collecting any data. So it was quite quick to collect. Thanks to some of the practice students at the QAS for helping me collect this data. So we got split times and race times from 14 international competitions. So they're Olympic Games, Commonwealth Games, European Championships, World Championships, Pan-Pacific Championships, and we looked at 4x200 freestyle relay finals in particular. And so we wanted to compare pacing in those relays to their individual race. So we then found their individual season's best time in that same year in the 200 freestyle so that we could compare. I won't go too much into the stats and bore you all with that, but just briefly, I ran some mixed linear models in R to get these results. So we ended up with quite a big database of 716 swims across 346 swimmers. So some swimmers appeared a few times in the database, depending on who they were. But for each of those, there was an individual swim and a relay swim so that we could directly compare how they paced in those. And so in terms of the data analysis, what we did is, so we focused on using the percentage of overall race times spent in each lap. And then I used that data to, I guess, create some categories. And so the first one was around the start lap strategy. So just looking at lap 1 separately. And the reason for that is because the dive start in swimming means that the first lap is much faster than all the other laps. So it makes sense to kind of look at this separately because it's, I guess, completely different. And so use a pretty simple approach, just looking at basically Z-scores, so standard deviation away from the mean. If it was within 1 standard deviation, it was an average start lap, and if it was above or below, it was considered fast or slow. And then we looked at the pacing strategy in laps 2, 3, and 4. And that was basically looking at the trajectory of, I guess, the slope. So we used a slope function in Excel, work out whether those 3 laps were pretty flat, so pretty even or consistent across the 3 laps, like the green line there, or whether they were negative paced, so gradually getting quicker, so the percentage of race time is actually getting lower, or the opposite of that, so positive, where they're gradually getting slower, like the red line there. So they're the different categories, I guess, we used. So if we start to look at the results, we've got some pretty interesting results. So we found that a fast start lap strategy led to a 0.5 to 0.7% decrement in overall performance. So that's overall 200 meter time, which is kind of what we thought would happen. It was nice that it actually worked out that way. And so if we look at these graphs, we've got the percentage of race time spent in lap 1 on the x-axis, and then the actual race time in seconds on the y-axis. So on the left here, we've got females. So we can see the higher percentage they spend on that first lap, the quicker they swim overall. So for females, it seemed that anything above, say, 23.2% on the first lap led to the fastest times. And we can equate that to a time in seconds for coaches. So that makes more sense for them. And it would depend, obviously, on what time their swimmer is swimming. And males, we found a similar thing, except there seemed to be more of like an optimum zone where anything between 23-ish and 24% on the first lap seemed to be best. But if you go lower than 23 or higher than 24, you actually swam slower. When we look at pacing in laps 2, 3, and 4, we found that positive pacing led to performance decrement of around 0.4, 0.5%, but we only found this in females. There wasn't an impact of pacing on performance in males, and there could be a few different reasons for that, which could be related to physiological differences, biomechanical differences, differences in the tactics in male and female races, and also the fact that a lot of the best male swimmers, they could swim any way they want because they're so good. It doesn't really matter what pacing strategy they use. So for example, we get some of the best male 200 freestyles in the world swimming with positive pacing, which we would think wouldn't be good. You don't want to gradually slow down in a race, but they're so good they can get away with it. So that kind of skews our data a bit. So when we put the start lap and pacing strategy together to kind of come up with an overall race strategy, you see something interesting here where 71% of swimmers who went out with a fast start lap strategy also ended up pacing positively, which makes sense from a physiological perspective. So we can say, and again, this is hypothesizing, we don't have any physiological data on these swimmers, but we can hypothesize that a fast start lap strategy would lead to a greater physiological cost at the start of the race, which means you're expending more energy, you're likely to fatigue earlier on, your technique is going to get poor, you're going to not be able to streamline, your execution of turns is going to be worse, and so you gradually, your swimming velocity is going to get slower as you go, which hence you get the positive pacing. So it makes sense, and there's actually some research in other sports to show that that's actually the case. It'd be good to be able to actually test that in swimming. So this one just a similar graph to before, but we're looking at the impact of the first lap on the last 2 laps. So on the x-axis there, we've got lap 1 percentage. And the graph on the left, the y-axis is lap 3 percentage, and the graph on the right is lap 4 percentage. So in both of these, we can see the relatively slower you go out in the first lap means that laps 3 and 4 are likely to be relatively faster. Whereas you go out faster in the first lap, your laps 3 and 4 are likely to be slower. And again, that makes sense with the previous results that we've seen. So then we actually compare relay and individual events. We can see that the start lap strategy, in terms of percentage here for males and females across individual and relay events, this just gives the categories, I guess, for each of those. Oh, sorry about that. So we can see that males are actually going out slightly faster relative, so their percentages start slightly lower than females, and also that relays, people go out slightly faster than they do in individual events, and that could be because of the flying start in the relay. However, there's actually no evidence to support that extra momentum that you theoretically gain from a flying start is actually carried through the whole first 50. So we're still seeing swimmers probably going out a bit faster in a relay, even with that taken into account. And then with the pacing strategy, we actually see that more swimmers display positive pacing in relays than they do in individual events, an increase here of 13% for females and 7% for males. So that's interesting, and we kind of hypothesized that might be because, so in a relay event, if you're positioned on the second, third or fourth relay leg, you can stand on the block, see what's going on in the race. You can see exactly where your team is positioned. If your team is quite close to, say, a medal position, you could be more likely to potentially try and chase that team down, which means you might end up pacing positively because you're probably potentially going to go out harder than you're physiologically capable of going out. So you're going to end up probably pacing positively, which, as we've seen, tends to lead to a poorer performance. So I guess the key outcomes of this one were the start lap strategy has a major influence on our overall performance. So we recommended that swimmers be more conservative at the start. We're not saying go out slow, but we're saying just be more conservative. We want to conserve energy for the second half of the race rather than using it all up at the start. Also practicing when tapered if possible and in race suits. So tapering has a big impact on how hard or easy a certain speed feels. So when you're tapered, you go out the same speed. It feels a lot easier. So people tend to go out faster than they should because it feels easier than when they're under load in full training load. But that can be very dangerous because they've not trained to be able to go out that fast. And also race suits has an impact as well because you swim faster in a race suit. Race strategy should be tailored to the individual, so should suit their physiological, biomechanical, so psychological characteristics. So not every swimmer should necessarily swim the same way. We also recommend that swimmers swim the same race plan for their individual events and their relay events. So don't go changing your race plan for a relay just because you're swimming in a relay and there's extra pressure to swim well for the team. Actually just stick to your individual race plan because that's what you've trained to execute, and you're probably going to swim the fastest time swimming it that way because that's the way you've planned your individual event. Okay, so moving on to the next study, we did a pacing questionnaire where we just wanted to know how much coaches, swimmers and support staff knew about pacing, what they thought about it, did they think it was important. So this was a bit of a challenge, I guess, to get people to do it. So I kind of took a different approach and actually went to training sessions in person and gave out numerous iPads for people to do these questionnaires on, thinking that people just wouldn't do it if I sent out an email. Coaches don't respond to emails, so that would have been a waste of time. So that worked pretty well. We got some pretty good numbers there. And in terms of the results, so one of the questions was around, we wanted people to select what pacing profile they thought was the most successful for each event. And this was swimmers, coaches and support staff. And so most of the pacing profiles they selected aligned with what we typically see and what the literature says, but there were differences between coaches, athletes and support staff along the way. There seemed to be a lot of confusion around classifying it based on speed and on effort. So we instructed people to think of this in terms of swimming speed. So you're talking a positive pacing profile means your swimming speed is getting slower as the race goes on. And this is going to be completely different to how your effort is paced, I suppose. And I think this ended up causing a lot of confusion. So the first lap is, like I said, is always faster because of the dive start. So to maintain velocity, effort probably has to increase, especially with longer events. And the most successful swimmers, they don't actually get quicker. All they do is they just maintain velocity. And so this is something, I mean, it's interesting finding to see that people struggle between speed and effort, differentiating them. But potentially I could have asked the question both ways and asked them to do it based on speed and effort. And that way we might have got some better results. But unfortunately, I didn't think of that at the time. So this is what we found. There's a lot of numbers on here, don't worry too much, but each event, the percentage of coach, athletes and staff who pick different pacing profiles. And so we see for 50-meter events, pretty much everyone picked an all-out pacing strategy. So that was what we expected. Although if you think about that in terms of swimming speed, a 50-meter race is always going to be positive because you're always going to get slow off the dive. We did see some differences where some coaches were selecting an even pacing profile, which in terms of swimming speed is just not possible for a 50-meter event, like I said, because of the dive. And we also had then some staff and some coaches selecting positive, which, like I said, would be much more realistic for a 50. There's a bit of confusion there because an all-out pacing profile is, I guess, defined as an all-out maximum effort from the start. So again, that relates to effort itself. So that can be quite confusing for people. Then we look at the 100-meter events. See most people picking even or positive, but we tend to see more coaches picking even. Now, again, in a 100-meter event, if we're looking at it in terms of swimming speed, an even pacing profile is not possible. The first lap is always faster than the second, and swimming velocity will always decline from the start to the end. You might be able to maintain at the end, but the only way you can get an even pacing profile is if you take out the dive start. So that was interesting in itself. So yeah, both of those should have been positive, but people selecting even pacing may have been thinking maintenance of effort and of velocity after the dive. But like I said, to maintain velocity, effort likely has to increase. When we look at 200-meter plus events, we see some slight differences again. 200-meter and above, most people pick even or negative pacing, which is kind of what we expect. However, a lot of athletes selected negative for 200-meter events, which again would be quite challenging to achieve unless you take out the dive start or even the whole first lap. Potentially that could be possible. So interestingly, athletes didn't change what pacing profile they picked across strokes. So for example, 200 freestyle compared to 200 breaststroke is paced quite differently, but they didn't pick up on that at all. A negative profile is unlikely, but might relate to effort. And so again, I think a lot of athletes especially were picking based on effort rather than thinking about it in terms of speed. And then if we look at the 4, 8, and 1500 freestyle, we've got some parabolic in there. I guess all those options are feasible for those. So we also found athlete responses were influenced somewhat by experience level and age. So, and I think it might be down to the ability to differentiate between that speed and effort. So we had a lot of younger athletes, for example, select the negative pacing profile for a 100-meter butterfly event, which, like I said, is just not possible in terms of swimming speed. But if they're thinking about it in terms of effort, they're thinking they want to try and maintain speed or drop off as little as possible. So they're actually going to have to increase their effort. So that would be a negative, I guess, negative pacing profile in terms of effort. So I think that affected a lot of our results. I guess the second part of this study, which we ended up writing a separate paper for, I also did coach interviews one-on-one with some pretty high-level coaches, and we just wanted to gain some more detailed insights into how they program training, how they actually improve pacing skills in their swimmers. So this one actually got accepted, has just been accepted in the International Journal of Sports Science and Coaching. So that's good, which is tricky to get qualitative research accepted into journals, so that was exciting. And so out of the interviews, we came up with some different themes emerged. So a lot of the questions were either related to training or competition. And these are the different kind of sub-themes in each of those areas that came out. And I guess they mainly related to the questions that I asked. And so the key outcomes from this were, it was quite surprising and shocking, I suppose, the lack of regular monitoring and feedback of things like stroke rates, stroke counts, and split times especially. So although a lot of coaches monitor those things, there were quite a few very high-level coaches that didn't monitor those, and they said they didn't. And these things are pretty important for pacing skill development. Like, how are we meant to improve pacing if we're not providing feedback to our swimmers on their split times? Where coaches often ask them to split a certain way in training, so they're asking them for even pacing, but they don't take split times. So that's a bit counterintuitive to me. Also, relatively low prevalence of pacing aid use. Not many coaches were using pacing aids, and the big barriers were cost. Some of them are quite expensive. unreliable technology, and they don't like to rely on technology. They don't like to waste time trying to get things to work. So unless they have a sports scientist that's there to do that for them, they're unlikely to do it for themselves. And final thing was, it's important to consider the individual needs of each swimmer, even in large squads. So that was a real challenge for a lot of coaches working in large squads, was things like the ability to monitor stroke rate when you've got a squad of 20 and it's just you coaching. That's tricky. But then there were other coaches in that scenario who were able to do it because they set up the set to be able to do that. So making sure that you're not just programming for the squad and you're actually considering the individual needs of your swimmers. So moving on to the fourth study, here we wanted to look at, I guess, from coaches not using pacing aids a lot, and some new technology coming out. We wanted to test the reliability and accuracy of some pacing aids compared to just normal self-paced swimming during sub-max and high-speed swimming. So the two, I guess, pacing aids we used were a wearable metronome, which just sits under the cap, keeps at set intervals. You can change it to be however quick you want, and then underwater pacing lights. So you can see there's a strip of LED lights placed on the bottom of the pool. Swimmers just have to follow them. You can prescribe what pace you want it to go, and they just keep their head in line with the lights. So we used a group of 20 swimmers in total, and we did two parts. We had a time-based pacing part one, and then part two was stroke rate-based pacing. And in both parts, 2 sessions were involved. So one session was a sub-max session and one session was a high-speed session, and they were at least 24 hours apart. And the 3 conditions we had, like I said, underwater lights, metronome, we compared both of those to self-pacing. Unfortunately, due to some difficulties with the lights, we only used them in part one. We intended to use them in part two, but to put it bluntly, they broke, so we couldn't use them. So that was a bit of a shame. But just to briefly, I won't go through in detail the protocols itself, but there's the session details there of what they actually did. We just did a randomized crossover design. So we had the 3 conditions. The sub-max session, there were 2 paces. The high-speed session was the same pace. Sub-max session was freestyle only, just aerobic pace. So most swimmers will do their aerobic training in freestyle. And then session 2, the high-speed one, was more specific, and they were allowed to do their preferred stroke, except for backstroke, because you can't see the pacing lights until we get a fancy system that suspends them above the pool, which should be really cool. And so with all of this, we set them for even pacing. So we wanted each 50-meter lap to be exactly the same time. So we didn't want pace fluctuating at all. So again, I won't go through the numbers on this, but in terms of reliability, it was high across all conditions and all speeds. So the pacing lights, the metronome, and self-pacing, they were all reliable. So swimmers were able to repeat the same time quite consistently, but the lights and metronome did have slightly higher ICCs than self-pacing. The self-pacing was still pretty good. So in terms of pacing accuracy, so we'll go through, so PB plus 30 seconds is on the left here. Okay, so we've got time and stroke rate on the same graph here. So we can see for time, the self-pacing, they went too quick at this slower pace, which we often see swimmers struggle to swim slow enough. So when they self-pace themselves, they just went too quick. And this is compared to a target time. And then with the stroke rate, they were far too high when they self-paced, because they were slightly better with the metronome. But there's quite a big variability there as well. Then we go slightly quicker, so PB plus 20 seconds. Accuracy was much better. Those bars are much smaller, closer to 0. All of them were pretty good. Similar with high speed, they were all pretty good. And there's some significant differences there where the metronome was slightly less accurate than self-pacing and underwater lights, but it's a very minimal difference there. So if we just look at, that's looking at overall time, but now if we look at the actual split times, this is just one example from the PB plus 30 seconds, we can see the laps across the bottom there, and then whether they were above or below the target time. And so we see some massive pacing areas in the first lap at this slower pace. So swimmers are going out way too fast, swimming at a much higher stroke rate than they needed during this first lap, and then it kind of settled down a little bit. But we can see with these green bars here, pacing was the most even with underwater lights. So we were looking for even pace. With the underwater lights, there was less than 1% on each lap error, so they came out the best. We look at high speed again. This is looking at the split times again. So we see the same thing, self-pacing for both time and stroke rate. They're going out way too fast on the first lap, and then they go too slow on the second lap. So overall, their time and stroke rate might average out to look okay if you look at the total time, but when you look at the split times, they're not swimming at an even pace. So again, pacing very close to even with the underwater lights. So a few practical considerations to, and I always put this on there because people are like, oh yeah, the lights look really awesome. And they do, and the results come out really well, but unfortunately, we had major issues with some braking because water was leaking in. You also can't use them for backstroke at this point. They're very expensive. So although the wearable metronome didn't come out as good for accuracy as the lights, they're much cheaper and easier to use, much more accessible to coaches. So just moving quickly on to the final study. So it was a bit, the plan was to do a big, I guess, intervention study with the pacing lights, but that kind of went out the window when they broke. So because of the limitations with the metronomes, the metronome is a fixed pace, you can't change it with each lap. And we also, the timing wise of this study, it was hard to get access to squads. It was right before trials for World Championships, so we're really struggling with ideas of what to do here. Then I sort of had a brainwave, I guess, thanks to the coaches who did my interview. They mentioned about, I guess, some little games they used to play where they turn the clocks off and the swimmers have to guess what time they went, rather than always being told what time they went, actually guess how fast they think they went, and then compare it to what they actually went. So what we ended up doing, it was a pretty last minute study design, to be honest with you. And we wanted to just look at how accurately swimmers could pace, just aerobic efforts, using some different pacing strategies. So we wanted them to pace even, negative and positive. Unfortunately, we only had access to them across a 5-week block, and we could only use them for 1 session a week. So we didn't have much access, but we figured it was better than nothing. So we had 2 groups. We had a distance group and a speed group. Quite small numbers, again, unfortunately, but that was just all we had to work with, and that's what you deal with when you're working with high performance squads and coaches who are giving up their swimmers to you at really important times. So I won't go into too much what they did, apart from that they had to do 2 efforts even pace, 2 efforts negative pace, and 2 efforts positive pace. So we wanted to see if they could actually change those paces, and we gave them all individual target times. And again, the paces they were going at, it was an aerobic pace. It was quite slow for them. So fatigue shouldn't have been an issue. So with the distance group, this is just when they did their negative pacing. And this is, so we've got week number across the x-axis, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then we've got blue is whether they were close to their target total time for their 600-meter effort. And then the orange and green are the 2 split times. So you can see the blue bars are fairly good, like the pacing error, in week 1 is pretty low, 0.6%. And we can see, although the blue bars show that the pacing error for total time wasn't too bad, we see a much higher error in that second 300. And in negative pacing, that means the second 300 is the faster pace. So they weren't too bad with a slower pace, but when the pace got faster, the error was maybe 2 to 3%, which for a 600, as you can see, they're related to about 9 to 12 seconds. So that's quite a big difference in time there. When we look at the speed group, this is just across all pacing strategies. Again, we've got the weeks across the bottom. If you look at the blue bars, the total error is not too bad, but there's quite a lot of error in the split times. So they were all over the place, and it's quite variable week to week. So yeah, we found a very high variability across the weeks. So just because they could pace well in week 1 didn't mean that they could do that every week. So what we found was basically there were no clear improvements in pacing across the 5 weeks, which I guess we probably realistically didn't expect to see, given that we only had them for 1 session per week for 5 weeks. We didn't have much contact time with them. Ideally, we would have done 2 or 3 sessions per week for 5 weeks, and we might have seen something. Pacing actually was already quite high in week 1, so they were pretty good at pacing. And although the error was low for total time, there was quite a lot of error for split times. And this is why it's important to measure splits in training. So coaches will give them a target time and they'll come in at the end of the effort and they'll go, oh yeah, you were only 2 seconds out from your target time. Awesome. But if you ask them to pace it negatively, you haven't taken the splits, you don't know that they've actually paced it negatively. And the chances are they may have not, they may have been way off. And we also see the highest pacing errors at those faster paces when they were asked to swim slightly faster. But very variable from week to week. So it's difficult to, I guess, find any improvements when it changed so much week to week. And we figured that was because each week they were in a different state. So they were doing their normal training program. We had no control over what training they were doing. Their volumes stayed pretty consistent, but we don't have a breakdown of the intensities in those volumes. So 1 week they could have been feeling pretty good and pretty fresh. We did this at the start of the week, so they were Monday afternoon, Tuesday morning sessions. But the next week they could have been feeling pretty rubbish. Could have been out on the weekend or doing God knows what. So stuff like that will affect how variable they are as well. Just a quick shout out to Ronnie and Emily who were on the line for helping me with this study. They were a massive help. I literally could not have done it without them. So thank you guys so much. Finally, so I guess if we talk about 3 key take-home messages from the whole PhD, greater emphasis should definitely be placed on developing pacing skills from a young age. Often coaches start too late, and by the time they're senior athletes, they just can't pace well. So if we develop those skills when they're young, then they're going to be better when they're older. Pacing aids could be useful training tools to improve pacing ability, but there needs to be more development in the technology for coaches to be able to actually use them in the day-to-day environment so that they're robust and they're easy to set up and coaches aren't put off by using them. And then coaches and athletes would definitely benefit from some education around pacing. There isn't much out there up till now. Like I've run quite a few workshops with coaches and they really enjoy it, but up until now there's not really been much within the coach education space on pacing. So that's something we definitely need to work on. And that's pretty much my whole PhD. Thanks to University of Canberra and obviously QAS SPIKE and Swimming Australia for helping me complete my PhD. Thanks guys.